to fight on the landing ground.
Thank you for joining us. You are listening to A Radio, and this is The Morning Moment. Please click on the follow button on Spreaker.com. This piece is based on Fox and Friends, July 20th, a link on my site. But really this story is based on Canada, a story that comes from a Vancouver newspaper referenced in this piece, which I'm going to play you. But that's not the point that I want to get over. No, the point is that whilst this piece does an admirable job trying to both understand and justify what they think 57 genders Trudeau has done, it's what he's done and continues to do. It doesn't tell the whole story. Here's the piece. Links on my site.
As the world grapples with the refugee crisis and the threats from terrorists pledging to infiltrate their ranks, a new op-ed claims that Canada may have lost track of 50,000 Syrian refugees in Canada. Top Canadian officials saying, quote, the Liberals had a plan to monitor whether the mostly Arabic-speaking refugees were learning English or French, working, receiving social assistance, and going to school, but the government has failed to follow through. Here to react, Douglas Murray, author of The Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Identity, and Islam. As you can see, he's joining us this morning from London. Douglas, good afternoon to you there.
Good to be with you.
Okay, so Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, announced he would accept up to 25,000 many undocumented Syrians. What could possibly go wrong?
Yes, I mean, all your viewers will remember that moment just before the inauguration of President Trump where Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada ostentatiously boasted on Twitter that Canada would always be open to people fleeing war or oppression. He was obviously setting it up as in contradiction to the United States of America, which was obviously becoming some barbaric country.
Right.
Now, I mean, the thing about this is that Justin Trudeau was obviously just auditioning for a sort of virtue signalling role on Twitter, and he opened the country up to, among other things, many thousands of Syrian refugees. There's around 50,000 that seem to have come in by now, but he, it seems, hasn't kept track of them. Since the photo ops in the first days, there's been very little information we can learn about what's happened to these people. Mm-hmm. The last report was in 2016 from the government, and that, among other things, showed that only, I think, 10% of government-assisted refugees from Syria were in any kind of employment in Canada.
Sure.
So perhaps that's why 2 years later, reporters from the Vancouver Sun haven't been able to find any information from the Canadian government about what has happened to these people.
Absolutely. They simply have not updated any status reports so that folks know where they are, if they're still there, if there are more than they thought before. But, you know, Douglas, when you look at the number of migrants who have gone into, for instance, Germany, I mean, and now Angela Merkel she's in a pickle politically because of all the trouble that gesture in the beginning, that humanitarian gesture, it looked great, but now they're facing the real life consequences of those thousands of people in their country.
We all have this problem now everywhere in the world, in the developed world, of politicians who sometimes seem to do things for, you know, tomorrow morning's newspapers or today's reaction on Twitter. And just opening up your country to migration on this scale is something that affects your country for generations. It doesn't go away in a 24-hour news cycle. And the German government is seeing this now. The Swedish government is seeing this now. Every country in Europe is seeing the consequences of this now, what I warned about in my book. And that's because we have to ask far deeper questions about this. It's not enough to virtue signal. You've got to work out what you're going to do. And if you bring in tens of thousands of refugees, let alone the illegal migrants that have come into Europe in recent years, then you've got to have some plan. You can't just leave them in the country. It appears that's what Canada has done, and now it just wants to cover over the consequences of that decision.
But, you know, Douglas, the problem with bringing in all these Syrian refugees is the fact that a lot of them, and we've seen stories about how ISIS would try to infiltrate various Western nations to try to infiltrate and do whatever ISIS does because they didn't have proper paperwork. And so for all of these leaders to be going, yeah, come to my country, we're going to take care of you, it looks like to you a lot of those gestures are just simply the PC, the politically correct thing to say at the time.
Well, they certainly are. There is certainly a security dimension to this. It's already been demonstrated in Europe many, many times, the security threat of this. Of course, many of the people fleeing the Syrian civil war, most of them, are trying to flee or trying to flee groups like ISIS. But, I mean, this is the set of problems we have. There is obviously the security component. But the much more obvious one is the idea that you can save, for instance, people fleeing from the Syrian civil war, and that the best idea is to put them into Canada, is a terrible mistake. There's a Swedish academic who pointed out a couple of years ago that you can look after 100 Syrians in the neighbouring countries around Syria for every one person you can look after in Syria. It costs the same amount. Right. So it's 100 times more cost inefficient to take them to Sweden. I don't think anyone's done the stats, certainly nobody in the Canadian government would want to do the stats, for how much more it costs to bring a refugee to Canada than it does to look after refugees in the areas around Syria. But it must be at least 100 times. So this humanitarian gesture, which is really just a humanitarian audition by Justin Trudeau, actually doesn't have the well-being of most of the Syrian refugees in mind. And it has no idea of what to do, for instance, once the Syrian civil war comes to an end, which it will at some point.
It will.
Do these people go home? Will the Canadian government assist them in going home? It seems they haven't thought any of it through.
Well, you know what, Douglas? Maybe after this segment, the Canadian government will issue an update and we'll know where all those people are and how many there are.
I wouldn't wait too long for it.
All right, we'll stand by. Douglas Murray, he's written a great book. It's called The Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Identity, and Islam. It is an eye-opener. Thank you, sir, for joining us live from London.
They both underestimate the figures of refugees considerably, claiming only 50,000 refugees have come to Canada, rather than the 2.5 million that they're planning to come to Canada. 2.5 million. And those figures are from the Canadian government themselves. But that's just part of the story. In my mind, and in many others, it's far more serious and sinister. No, it's very, very simple in my mind. 57 Genders Trudeau and others see this illegal incursion into Canada as nothing more than future Liberal Communist voters in a generation or more. But that may be cynical, but why else would he and his colleagues be speeding up the citizenship process by bypassing all means of checking and confirming their identities? I've said this before, I've told my American colleagues this. Once they have Canadian passports, they have no past at all, and they can cross the border into the United States with impunity because they are Canadian citizens. The only possible reason of rushing their pathway to citizenship is not to help them, it's for them to help the Liberal Communist Party of Canada and help them stay in power. As I have said many times before, they will say anything, do anything to remain in control, and that includes selling out the safety of our country. Nothing else matters to them, just power and control. Oftentimes, the simplest answer is the right one. You can find more at aradio.wordpress.com, where you can find links to us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Gab and email. We are continuing to reach out to you, so please pass on the links. Please click on the follow button on Spreaker.com. You can listen to all my morning moments at Spreaker.com under A Radio, that's EHRADIO, A Radio. And please click on the like button. And you can find all my podcasts and morning moments at aradio.wordpress.com and click on the Morning Moments tab.